Bill Chan, welcome to Cultural Attaché. You are the director of a new production of Puccini's Madama Butterfly at Boston Lyric Opera. So I'm happy that we have a chance to talk about this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So when Madama Butterfly first debuted in 1904, it was a two-act opera at La Scala, and it was poorly received. Puccini reworked it, and a few months later, as a three-act opera, it was overwhelmingly well received, but he continued tinkering it for a while. What is it about this story that you think resonates so strongly and so deeply with people?
I think it really comes from the music. Um, Puccini has written such a beautiful opera with such strong musical characters, such emotional highs and lows. I mean, like it's really like why does one like one roller coaster over the other roller coaster, right? It's the feeling of butterflies, both extreme joy and relief, and then just like utter despair. And you just ride between those two emotions for most of the opera. And I think that's why people musically, and I think that's why people like it. Um, however, it's always been sort of a controversial opera. In the 40s, it was actually canceled for a little bit because people were afraid that it was empathizing with Japanese people too much. And now it's again undergoing another sort of canceling because of its sort of, rightly poor depictions of Asian people, right? Caricatured depictions, what it reinforces about Asian women. We're also having a second look at this opera, especially in the light of, this sort of anti-Asian social hysteria that has been, come out since COVID and really just shown us that our acceptance of Asian Americans here is really just a very thin veneer, the smallest thing. And we are not accepted here anymore. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in the works around this opera, which makes it sort of a relevant and urgent piece right now.
Well, and we'll get to some of the politics of this a little bit further down the line in this conversation. But going back to the story, it seems to me that we as an audience, as a society, and this is worldwide, seem to embrace love stories where the two people do not end up together. You look at Romeo and Juliet, you look at Titanic, you look at Casablanca, you look at The Way We Were. I mean, the list goes on and on. The love stories that resonate most with us are the ones where people don't end up together.
Yeah.
Why do we like that tragedy so much when we don't want that in our own lives?
I think the arts are a way for us to explore emotions in a safe way because they don't actually happen to us, but they can imagine what what these really extreme emotions are. Like what happens if you lose the love of your life, or what happens if things don't work out for us. Um, it's almost like we get to imagine the worst case scenario in the safety of our theater seat, right? And I think that's why we're attracted to tragedy. We like to be able to feel the full expression of human emotions in a way that we can then leave the theater and say, well, thank goodness my life is not like that, or thank God I still have my husband, or whatever that is. So I think that's part of why we have tragedy, and also why we like scary stories and adventure stories, right? Like nobody wants to be chased around by scary things, but it gives us a thrill to at least have that experience in the safety of a movie, you know?
Right. Right. Now, when and where did you first experience Madame Butterfly?
Oh God. I think I probably first saw it at the Met, the current production, which is beautiful. I think I saw it before I had much of an awareness of um, sort of any of this advocacy, how we represent Asian people. Um, I just sort of saw it as just another fantasy that was just told in this sort of dramatic way, just like there's stories that take place in Germany and other places. But then, just as I started to dig a little bit deeper and think a little harder and just be exposed to some of the um, I don't know, just the way we do things in opera and ballet that we've inherited from Europe, but that don't necessarily serve everyone. That wow, these stories have power and they're telling a specific narrative over and over again at the expense of Asian voices, and what do they reinforce, and what do they tell us? In works like Madama Butterfly, this hypersexual, hypersubmissive Asian woman, what happens when we see that on stage? And then in reality, Asian women are being pushed onto subways, tracks, and followed home and stalked home and shot down at their places of work, blamed for a disease. How are those two things connected? When the arts are a way to empathize with the other, what if our arts aren't doing us that favor anymore? Just because how we're depicting them is from 100+ years ago. I mean, if you look at Madama Butterfly, the most important defining moment in Puccini's time was Commodore Perry and the forced opening of Japan, right? The Meiji Restoration. That was the sort of big on the imagination of Europeans. Since then, like, Commodore Perry doesn't mean anything to us now. We have 100+ years of emotional baggage, cultural baggage about Japan, especially with World War II, that Puccini could have never even imagined. So, if we want this work to still have the resonance, we need to help clear away some of that 100 years of cultural baggage so that Puccini's intentions can be kept pure. So that's what I tried to do with this piece.
That brings up a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So we'll go to the politics before we go to some of the concepts that you've created. Sure. To get around them. Is there something to learn by seeing how previous generations presented themselves and how they presented stories? Is there something to learn from those mistakes that should allow for them to exist in spite of their flaws, in spite of these depictions that are not necessarily appropriate?
Sure. So I think there's a difference between static art forms like photography, painting, sculpture, film, and the performing arts, which are living art forms, right? So the static art forms, you need to keep them as is, right? Birth of a Nation is arguably a great American film. It's also a very problematic film, but we need to keep it alive and look at it within a context of where it belongs, which is in a museum, to understand how it changed the minds about people in a dangerous way. We need to keep that lesson of Birth of a Nation. I do not want to see it remade for television. I do not want to see it as a Christmas special. It belongs where it is, and we can look at it as an artifact of its time to take a lesson forward for us. With the performing arts, however, we have a different set of rules. The performing arts have to be a mirror to our current moment. They have to reflect who we are of our time. And if those things don't hold true, the art isn't honest and doesn't have integrity. So think about Shakespeare, for example. I mean, probably everyone has seen a Shakespearean play that isn't set in the traditional setting. In fact, if you've ever seen a Shakespearean play with a woman in it, you're already seeing something radical and very, very different. And the reason we've done that is because we need the art to better reflect our times. And arguably, the reason we are still doing Shakespeare 400+ years later is not because we have kept it in the old way of doing it. Because if we were to say, well, women aren't allowed to be in Shakespeare because that's how we are doing it, and let's watch that and take a lesson from that and just appreciate that for what it is, well, that's pretty shitty for women today and women audiences and women actors. So, is there still a way to do Shakespeare? Of course there is, and so it's by reimagining that we get to keep these works alive. So again, it's not something where you can just put a disclaimer on it and say, well, sorry, blackface is offensive, but we can't learn that blackface is offensive unless we see it on stage. I mean, that doesn't have integrity. You can't make art that way and be serious, especially when we're making art for a diverse 21st century American audience, which these works, a lot of the old ballets and operas, they're made for Europeans by Europeans, and most white Americans are not Europeans. So let's stop pretending that, right? We are Americans. We are different. So we need a bigger center for these works because our worldview is different than these works. So if we are already reimagining these works, in opera, I mean, you've probably seen the Magic Flute set on the moon or La Boheme set in the Lower East Side, whatever. If we're already reimagining these settings, why can't we just reimagine them with a little bit more sensitivity, especially if we want these works to resonate with many, many more people, which include Asian people? So that's what I tried to do. So it's not taking anything away. It's actually the opposite of cancel culture if you think about it, which would be saying, Puccini is inherently, a colonialist white person and whenever he does it is inherently racist, right? and then we shouldn't do Butterfly, right? That's canceling Butterfly. That's cancel culture. What I'm saying is, let's use our creative imagination. Let's imagine this music with a bigger story for more people. And then let's use that money we make from Butterfly ticket sales to commission a female composer or a Black composer or an Asian composer or someone from, from today, from now, who is alive now, to make new work that reflects us, so we can contribute to the canon as well. But that's also the sort of bigger picture that I'm hoping this process brings out.
Of course. Well, let's talk a little bit about the concept that you have for this.
Sure.
People who haven't, read up on this production, tell me about setting Madame Butterfly in 1940 San Francisco.
Yeah. So, just thinking about other periods in our history where Asians have been demonized, that sort of was very much on my mind the past couple of years. I've been spat on just walking down the street. My older Chinese father has been, only until recently, he is like willing to leave the house again, and is like not scared to leave the house, let alone go to an opera, right? And so that's just weighing heavily on my mind. I just can't help it. That's just my lived experience in this moment is something that I've just been thinking about. So thinking back to other periods in time where, that was a moment, and that's also the 1940s, right? The 1940s probably defines our relationship with Japan more than any other time, you know, in Puccini's lifetime. I mean, there's still people who are alive in World War II who were incarcerated. All of our current geopolitics of Asia still revolve around and are repercussions of World War II in Japan, right? So that just seemed like a very fertile place to reimagine the story for a congruent setting. But again, my favorite sort of creative question, my creative North Star is the question, what else could it be? And I use the example like when you're, like a pen, when you're a kid, the pen can be a magic wand or a lightsaber or a broomstick, but it's also just a pen, right? So depending on how you want to imagine it, it can be many different things. So what else could it be? So that's the larger approach I have with this opera. So what else could a geisha be? Okay, starting at the heart of Butterfly, it's about a geisha, right? So a geisha in Japanese means artist, means performer, right? So okay, 1940s performer. And then I was privileged enough to moderate a Q&A with Arthur Dong, who's a brilliant filmmaker. He directed Forbidden City, USA, a really great documentary about this period from the 20s to about the 60s in San Francisco Chinatown, where there were all these nightclubs where Asian folks were excluded from the white clubs, so they created their own spaces, and they were quite subversive in what they did. They were sort of just, you'd think you were going in to buy a ticket to see some Oriental girls blossoms, and when you go in, it's not just like American girls doing the Charleston, like the same dances you'd see in the other clubs. They're just Asian American women, not white American women or whatever. So just seeing that as potential. Okay, so what if Cio-Cio San was instead Butterfly, a jazz singer in the 1940s? Also, just looking at that history, right? Like we like to see Asian folks as a monolith, but actually we're quite different. And I really have to credit my collaboration with Nina Yoshida Nelson, who has sung over 200 performances of Suzuki, is the founder of the Asian Opera Alliance, and knows the Butterfly inside and out. I tease her, I say, oh, this is your Nutcracker. My Nutcracker is your Butterfly. And her family was incarcerated in the 40s. So, and she knows the emotional impact of this opera. So being able to tie those two things together of, this Japanese American who's hiding her ethnicity, which was common in the 40s, trying to pass as Chinese or other Asian groups, who is a performer. She's a singer, and she's outed by the neighbor who sees her registering at the post office as a Japanese person. Yet, as the world is falling apart, this young Navy boy is sticking up for her, and they fall in love, and sort of this rich, opulent Oriental fantasy nightclub gives way to a dry and dusty, barren Japanese incarceration camp, and we're seeing, another side of the Asian American story, and I think it's there's still a love story, but it's not necessarily about Pinkerton and Butterfly, but there's definitely a love story in this production, a very real love story that I think many more people will relate to. So it doesn't hinge on the tragedy of, oh, well, that isn't that sad that poor Oriental gal killed herself at the end. Let's go out and have a cocktail. I think there's a deeper story that is in the Puccini music that I'm hoping that this production brings out, that is more relatable to everyone, not just Asian people, but to everybody who's alive today.
Well, I would assume anybody who tackles a story that has suicide in it, as this
Yeah.
one famously does.
Yeah.
As a director, is Cio-Cio San or Butterfly's suicide an act of bravery or not?
Well, that depends on if the character kills herself, and we're seeing a lot of productions nowadays where she doesn't always kill herself, um, and as well as other operas where Carmen's. There's many more Carmen's now where she's not stabbed, or she stabs Don Jose, or she doesn't die at all, or So I think we are questioning some of these stories. So just making the assumption that Cio-Cio San kills herself is again goes against this. What else could it be? So I'm not going to give away our ending, but just asking that question. Okay, so the character does have to die at the end, but what is another death that we all experience, or is there a death that um, is different than a honorific ritual suicide? What is a death that everybody can feel, that isn't just this abstract honor thing that we don't do in our society because we're not crazy Japanese people who, like, why on earth would anyone do that? Um, there's also all these ideas about, Judeo-Christian ideas about suicide that we are sort of programmed with, mental health. There's a lot of cross sections. It's messy. It's not, suicide doesn't mean what it meant in the context of this opera when Puccini wrote the opera. So that is something that modern directors have to deal with. And I think that's why we're seeing so much diversity in how this opera ends, which I think is really exciting. It keeps audiences guessing. It keeps them wanting to come back and see this story over and over again. And the fact that it, it doesn't always have to end that way and still work with the music, I think just shows you that it's a classic, that it's so beautiful that it can be many more stories than just one.
Well, all right. So apropos of that, since you have brought it into 1940s San Francisco in
Yeah.
California, I would assume that you don't want to just get people to be triggered intellectually, but you still want to keep them captivated emotionally. How
Oh,
does
yeah.
how does this combination of the intellectual and the emotional still add to the ultimately to the emotionality of the story?
Yeah, it's the scholarship that actually ultimately has to be invisible. I mean, Nina and I spent hours with Japanese American historians who are specialists on incarceration, looking at the costumes, looking at the sets. Would they have had this? Would they have had that? Would this person have been able to enter camp? How did the military people salute? All of those things, the scholarship of that is there to serve so that ultimately the libretto becomes invisible. The storytelling just feels real and it has integrity. So, Nina and I have been working on this production for 2 or 3 years, to try and get this right. But ultimately, it's about telling a story. It's about telling a rich, human, believable, honest story with integrity. And that's what I'm hoping, that you'll be able to just walk into this and just feel it. And the music tells you everything. I mean, that's the beauty of Puccini, right? Like, you don't need to know the words. It actually, like, doesn't matter at all, really. Like, if it's staged well, you see the emotions, you see the reactions, you hear the reactions. I mean, it's even just this process on a personal level has taught me to be so much more sensitive to the music, because it really um, there's no subtlety in Puccini. He's really telling you how you're supposed to feel at all times, and when the news hits the character and you see their emotions change when they get a piece of news, or they hear something, or they realize something, or their thought process. It's all there in the music because it had to be for the audience, that storytelling. And that's why I think Puccini still works, is because it's so easy to follow along. You don't need to speak Italian to really get it and fall in love with it and feel it on a deep level. So, yeah,
No, there was nothing subtle about Puccini.
no,
That subtlety was not his strong suit. So 4 years ago, in 2019, I saw a production that Josh Shaw and Pacific Opera Project did
yeah,
of Madama Butterfly,
yeah,
where all the Japanese characters' language was sung in Japanese. and all the American language was sung in English. And the idea was that these are barriers that they would have to have faced in the real world of Madame Butterfly. That
And
might
making sure they had music to take off their shoes, because a Japanese person would never walk into the house with their shoes on.
right, right. So there are all these things that it was. I thought it was a really interesting way of approaching Madame Butterfly. Madame Butterfly, as you've alluded to before, is a resilient opera. It has dealt with numerous interpretations, as many other operas have as well. Do you think this opera lends itself to more dynamic changes than other operas? And if so, why?
Um, Actually, I think that just in my research, it's the Orientalist repertory that is almost the hardest to reimagine because we love the fantasy. Orientalism has been a vehicle for spectacle for so long. I mean, can you imagine the Mezzoturando as anything but this giant Peking opera spectacle? Like, it's just so big, it's so beloved, it's so pretty. I mean, it's beautiful. It's problematic, but it's beautiful, right? And that's why it's the hardest to reimagine because it has gorgeous music and it just you want that perfume. We want it. We actually want we it's very attractive. The problem is it doesn't hold water when we are diverse, right? So when you're looking at an otherwise outside culture as an insider and going, "Ooh, I'm Japanese and that's not what we look like," or "Ooh, I'm Chinese, that's not I don't see myself in this at all." It's a very disorienting experience. But again, it was not made for us. It was made for Europeans by Europeans. So they didn't even need to consider how Asian people would feel. So I think Orientalism specifically, if you look at the history of ballet, if you look at the history of opera, it's been both a vehicle for innovation, but also for spectacle. So I think the Orientalist operas are the hardest to reimagine, and ballets, because we're stuck in how it's done. You can do Swan Lake anywhere, you can do the Nutcracker anywhere. Bohème, you've seen billions of Bohèmes, Magic Flute. I mean, every production, it doesn't matter. No one is true to the original production for a Magic Flute, right? It's part of the fun is reimagining it somewhere else. Even Carmen, my God, like it all has to be sort of Spanish-esque. But again, that's also one of those cultural operas where like you can't imagine Carmen taking place anywhere but Spain. It
I
has to be
can't I can't imagine Carmen, however, translated into Spanish,
right,
would be incredible.
right. So again, that's again a tangent of what else could it be, right? That's what we're asking the opera field to do in order to stay alive, is keep asking that question: what else could this work be? And so, yeah, I think Madame Butterfly is one of those harder ones because like people really love the way it's done. They love the kimono fantasy. They love the sakura. I mean, when you have the the picture of Puccini's music plus the kimono plus the sakura plus the moonlight, it's gorgeous. I mean, I get it, but then like you leave the opera house and it's like me love you long time, like that's the other side of it that's not so beautiful, and those go hand in hand, unfortunately. So that's why it's tricky.
Of course. Well, what were
I
the
mean,
conversations?
it's like drinking. It's like when you're giving up drinking. It's like no one wants to give up drinking. It's fun, right? Like that's why it's hard because people enjoy it.
Yeah, a
Or,
lot of
or
people.
any vice, right? That's hard to give
Right,
up your vices because they're fun, they're
right,
beautiful, they
exactly,
feel good.
exactly. So when you're working with a company like Boston Lyric Opera, who has a mission of exploring authentic storytelling, what are the conversations you have with them so that you come to a mutual agreement that this is the right way of approaching a Madame Butterfly?
Yeah, I was really privileged to be brought in to actually lead a conversation around butterfly first, called the butterfly process, which was essentially asking like, what's the problem with butterfly, and like, how does this work move forward in the future? We brought together historians and directors and singers and performers and artists and composers and folks like David Henry Huang Ro, other people who have been tangential to this work. And we looked at the Orientalism and the archetypes of geishas and the history of the opera itself, the performance history, um, but also tried to find clues of like how do we do this work in the future with integrity, not authenticity. It doesn't necessarily have to be more Japanese, but just how do we make it with more integrity, with more spirit of who we are today. And it was from that conversation. So we really had these sort of guardrails in place of what a future production could be, not necessarily in 1940, but just, sort of a roadmap for companies to say, like, or university programs or whatever. Hey, you can't afford a DI artist, but here's some resources to think about butterflies you're going into it, of how to tell the story in a way that has integrity. And out of that process, Bradley Vernatter, who's the general director of BLO, said, just like on a whim, what would you do with this opera? And so all of these like ideas had been floating around, and they were like, yeah, that sounds exciting and beautiful. How do we do this? And to be honest, I was sort of taken aback at first, that they were not only investing so many resources, but really willing to like walk the walk. Like, just, I don't know, there's a lot of performative racial stuff happening post George Floyd. And I think as artists of color, we are navigating these historically white spaces with a grain of salt, with a little bit like, really, you're really letting me do this? Because there's been so many times in the past, where they say, oh yes, we want to support you, and then it doesn't really happen that way. And I've just been blown away by BLO. Like, they've given us so much support. Um, the dream creative cast, creative team, just resources to really realize the vision in a rich way. And I think they're also seeing the potential for other companies to take on this work and to take on this production, because they've really invested the thought and the institutional resources to really make this a meaningful piece. So I just have never worked, with a company that has put that kind of care. I mean, there's a lot of things you don't see as well. We've done things like, we've had sessions with a woman named Chris Ham, who's an Asian American, a therapist, and I kind of roll my eyes at some of these, mental well-being things. But man, like, we're going in a room, we're working with a bunch of strangers, we're talking about what's hard about the career, how do we get ourselves into a vulnerable place to tell these stories in a really deep way. We're dealing with some pretty hard issues in this opera. And so we've had multiple sessions with Chris, and just the bonding, the openness, the vulnerability, the trust that we've been able to build with the cast so quickly. That's just something like you just don't do in other shows, but that has made such an important difference in terms of getting the best out of the performers, getting them to trust each other and to trust me and to be vulnerable so that we can tell better stories. And that's something that I want to take away and bring to other creative processes as well. But just that level of care, it has, oh, we need an intimacy director. Not even a question. Yeah, of course. Great. We'll make it happen. It just is really meaningful, and I hope that it's a trend that continues, and I hope it makes better art.
You sound like you're almost surprised by the process.
I am, because historically it has not been that way, and there's a lack of trust, I think, with a lot of artists of color who see performative lip service, but at the end of the day, that's not what it is. And I can't speak to all artists of color working with BLO, but my experience has been overwhelmingly positive, and it has been surprising.
Do you have faith that this will continue in the performing arts?
I think that if we can lead by example, if we can show that there is a positive way forward without canceling these works, but being, expanding the center, letting more voices in, and that'll also bring audiences in. I mean, we've also done something different too. I pressed upon the BLO team. I said, I know usually rehearsals are closed to anyone unless they give, X number of dollars and up. I want the community to be invited to every rehearsal. And we did that during the process. We had people just coming up and just emailing BLO and sitting in. They would have their lunch break. They would just come and sit in the back, COVID safe, but like enough distance. But just a lot of young people just wanting to see how it's made and how it's done. And our dress rehearsal last night, usually they have about, I don't know, 400 people, usually like a couple, family groups, sort of BLO family groups. there was almost 800 people, over 800 people. It was like a full performance of students and partners, and like it was just unprecedented for the company. But that's what we need to focus on if we want this art to continue to thrive, is um, getting people to have these lived experiences, live experiences.
You know, as you're saying that, it occurs to me my goddaughter just moved to Boston to go to Berklee School of Music. So I'm going to text her when we're done and say you should get a student ticket for this.
Yeah, opening night's tomorrow, so she should come while it's tomorrow's going to be a big night. So
I
there's still tickets, so she should get on it.
I will let her know. You know, early in this conversation, you mentioned that hopefully the revenues from a Madame Butterfly can be used to support the creation of new works by women, people of color, et cetera. You know, how important are new works in helping to tell more authentic stories as opposed to reworking and rethinking existing works from centuries ago?
Um, we need music that reflects the now, and we have stories to tell as living people. We cannot be stuck in our canonical past unless those works have speak to this moment. So there's no reason to do an old show just because it's an old show, unless there's something it can say about now or something that we need in this moment. Otherwise, don't do it. You know, um, yeah. I don't know. I think that's the tell here. I think new. I mean, we have to be champions of new work, but also, how do we know where we're going if we don't know where we've come from? We need that balance. So you do need to know the classics. You do need to know the history, and I'm a scholar too. That's a big part of my practice, is actually knowing that thing. So when I say, okay, I'm working on this ballet, it's from 1870 or it's from 1730. My last ballet was from 1730, and here's a joke. What's the joke? It doesn't make any sense to us today. So why was that joke funny in the 18 or in say 1730s? And so to have that historical context, then okay, if that's the way the joke landed in the 1730s, how does the joke land today? How do I make that same joke today? And if I can't make that joke, then I shouldn't do the work.
Fair enough. One last question for you, Phil. You
Sure.
mentioned that you've been spat upon, that your father was reluctant for quite some time as a result of the hysteria that was whipped up. You didn't say it specifically that was the hysteria whipped up because of COVID, but we also know who the bully was, that used his megaphone to make, to encourage people to be distrustful of others. Um, let's assume that this production is successful in Boston and has a life beyond Boston into other cities. What is your hope that this opera will do to change the minds of the kind of people who spat on you and made it difficult for your father to go out?
I think art is a way to bridge differences between people, whether it's, individual people or groups of people. Art builds empathy, and music is a way to cut through people's hearts. It cuts through all of the vulnerabilities, all of the walls. It goes right to your heart. And Puccini especially knew that, and he was very good at that. So if this way of doing the opera is a way to build empathy, um, for Asian people, is a way to say we are not going to do this again to anybody. We're not going to do this to Japanese Americans. We're not going to do this to Jewish people. We're not going to do this to Black people. We're not going to do this again to anybody. Um, if that can be part of the story, and when we can win over hearts, not just minds. It's not an intellectual debate we're having. It's an emotional one. Um, and art is a way to get people to see each other. Man, if you saw me as a real person, you wouldn't spit on me. So let me give you some good music to help you see me. And I think that's what this has the potential to do as a work.
Well, again, I said this before we started rolling. I am very sorry that I don't live in Boston because I am endlessly fascinated with this production and hope I get a chance to see it sometime in the not too distant future.
And let's hope so. Let's hope it gets picked up.
Yeah, well, as we were talking, I was thinking the best place for it is actually San Francisco Opera, not LA. That's where it should be if in California.
You're from your mouth to God's ears, and maybe their general director as well.
I was going to say, whoever the general director is God in that equation.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank
your
you so much.
time.
Of
I
course.
really
Thank you so
appreciate
much
it.
for taking the time.
Of course. And you are okay with me posting this, right?
Sure. Great.
Great. Thank you. And good luck with the performances of Madame Butterfly at Boston Lyric.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.